Incineroar might be the greatest Pokemon ever created. Since receiving its hidden ability Intimidate in March of 2018, Incineroar has been the most used Pokemon in every format besides 2018, where it was just edged out by Landorus. However, when you're not legal for 1/4 of the season, you do need to play a little bit of catch up. From 2019 onwards, it has been the most used Pokemon in every single format it's been allowed in, peaking at 91% usage in 2019's Moon series. Now, the question is, why is it so good, and will it continue to be the best Pokemon in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet? To start things off, it has a very solid defensive typing in Fire and Dark. While it has 4 weaknesses, it makes up for it with 6 resistances and an immunity. It has very respectable bulk at 95, 90, 90, and a very good attack stat for a support Pokemon at 115. When you pair that up with one of the best abilities in VGC, that being Intimidate, you have a very good Pokemon, but it gets even better. When you look at some of the best Intimidate Pokemon in past formats, you have Pokemon like Hitmontop that had access to Fake Out, Landorus with a pivoting move in U-turn, Arcanine with a very powerful stab move in Flare Blitz, while also having access to Will-O-Wisp. So what does Incineroar have in common with all these Pokemon? Well, first of all, it has Fake Out. It has pivoting options with U-turn and Parting Shot. It also has a very good stab move in Flare Blitz. It also had access to Knock Off in the Ultra Sun and Moon series. It can also run moves like Snarl, Will-O-Wisp, Taunt, Throat Chop. It even had success with Roar in the formats dominated by Xerneas. We've seen it run a bunch of different items from HP regen berries to resist berries, assault vest, safety goggles, focus sash, air balloon, and more. With all that being said, I'm pretty sure you can see why this Pokemon has been the #1 used in the past 10 formats it's been legal in. It also helps that it arguably was the 2 most broken restricted legendary Pokemon of all time, that being Zacian and Calyrex Shadow Rider. But now, I'm sitting here wondering how the power creep of Generation 9 paired with new items and moves will affect Incineroar's usage. I know most people will sit here and say, well, it was still the #1 most used Pokemon in a format where Kyogre was the 2nd most used Pokemon, so unless it's placed by a Pokemon that does the same job but better, it won't fall off. And while Iron Hands has been a dominant Fake Out mon throughout VGC 2023, it plays a very different role than Incineroar. The first thing I want to take a look at here are 2 new items that directly infect Incineroar, those being Covered Cloak and Clear Amulet. Clear Amulet is the most obvious, blocking Intimidate, and on top of that, causing Parting Shot to fail, which is incredibly good into Incineroar, causing certain matchups to be much harder. Next is the Covered Cloak, stopping Fake Out from flinching. It also stops Snarl from lowering your special attack, and even Flare Blitz from getting a burn on you. But this is where the next big question mark around Incineroar comes up. Will it get Knockoff again? It lost it back in Generation 8. But with the 2 marks reintroducing Knockoff as a TM, it's hard to believe it won't learn it once again. If it does get Knockoff back, this will definitely give it another very powerful tool to play with, helping especially into those Clear Amulets and Covered Cloaks. The next thing to consider here is how will Terra affect its place in the metagame. If you look at it in the sense that with Incineroar's return, the game will most likely slow down and a more balanced metagame will unfold. There will be Pokemon like Amoonguss that will use its Terra similar to how Amoonguss used it throughout 2023. With Terra Water, if your Incineroar doesn't have Taunt, Amoonguss and other support Pokemon should be able to stay on the board a lot longer in front of Incineroar. On the other side of the coin, on turns in which Incineroar would switch in, it was normally known for putting Fake Out pressure on the board. But with options like Terra Ghost, Pokemon that used to fear Incineroar on turn 1 might now be able to apply pressure back onto it. Similar to what we saw Pokemon like Chi-Yu do with Terra Ghost into Pokemon like Brian Hands and Rillaboom. There is also the question of how the new Terra type and other offensive Terra types will affect it. For example, I ran Terra Water Flutter Mane with Terra Blast and Choice Specs at OCIC this year as a way to deal with threats like Arcanine, while also having a good defensive matchup into Pokemon like Arcanine and Golden Joe. With all that being said though, I can see a world where Incineroar itself can abuse Terra, most likely using things like Terra Grass, Poison and Fairy. Even in a closed team sheet format like an online event, I could also see it using things like Terra Fire to catch people off guard and pick up some surprise KOs. Another thing to factor in is how its play will be different now that we are in the open team sheet era. Incineroar has always been so scary because you never knew exactly what moves or items it was running, making it slightly more manageable now these days. The next thing worth mentioning is how abilities that are good into Intimidate and stat lowering moves will affect it. For example, Competitive, Defiant, and Guard Dog. I'll get Guard Dog out the way first, as the only real option for it is Okidogi. It does have a pretty good matchup into Incineroar, simply because it gets a free +1 while also being able to threaten a one-shot with moves like Close Combat. The next is Competitive, and while Milotic and Empoleon both have pretty good matchups into Incineroar, sadly, they are just a little too underpowered in my opinion to see much play in the format. But finally, we have the Defiant Pokemon and the 2 Beasts Generation 9 included. First up is King Gambit, and while technically speaking, its matchup into Incineroar isn't very good, what it can potentially do is switch into moves like Snarl and Parting Shot, giving it a massive damage increase, and with access to things like Terra Fire, it can allow it to completely ignore the Incineroar and gun down its allies. But the main Defiant mon I want to look at here today is Annihilate. This is a ghost type that can't be faked out, and it's neutral to Incineroar's dark type stabs, and it loves Terra Fire, allowing it to tank things like Flare Blitz and Will-O-Wisp, while also setting up with Bulk Up, allowing it to threaten big damage with its fighting type stabs. With all that being said, there is still one more thing added in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet that I think could affect how good Incineroar is, and that is the insane power creep these games added. Now look, I could sit here all day and tell you how individually strong these Pokemon are, from the Treasures of Ruin having abilities that lower a Pokemon's stats. You have Pokemon like Chi-Yu with Beads of Ruin that lowers the special defense stat, and Chien-Pao lowering its defense stat. These Pokemon like to be commonly paired up with things like a Choice Specs Fluttermane or a Choice Banded Dragonite that also has Inner Focus, which prevents the Intimidate and also the Fake Out. Like seriously, look at this damage. A max HP, max special defense Incineroar still doesn't have a favorable roll into a Choice Specs Fluttermane next to a Chi-Yu with only 116 special attack. And a Choice Banded Dragonite has the option to threaten a one-shot with 2 different moves while also still doing massive damage with a Choice Banded Terra Normal E-Speed. And look, I could go on and on about all these new Pokemon like Iron Hands, Iron Bundle, Hisuian Arcanine, Ogerpon, and both forms of Ursaluna that all have solid matchups into Incineroar. Before we wrap this up, I want to actually say something nice about Incineroar, as I feel most of this video has been me nitpicking some of its potential weaknesses. What this mon does better than any other is really allow balance to thrive. From its ability to pressure Fake Out on lead while getting down and Intimidate, paired up with the ability to reduce the opponent's damage using moves like Snarl and Parting Shot, to dealing its own big damage with moves like Flare Blitz and Knockoff, to shutting down other support Pokemon with moves like Taunt. You can also use moves like Throat Chop to Throat Chop other Incineroars who are trying to Parting Shot and Snarl. There's so much this mon can really do. So now, it is finally time to answer the question. Do I think Incineroar will fall off in VGC 2024? The short answer is no. There's a reason why Incineroar is always on the top of the usage stats, and it's simply because this Pokemon has so much it can do, its bag is so deep, and its flexibility is so insane that it feels like there is always a set that would benefit your team. And one of the biggest issues with preparing for Incineroar is if you over prepare for it, then you won't be ready for what's sitting next to it and what it has in the back. Even if Incineroar doesn't end up as the #1 most used Pokemon, I can assure you it will still be in the top 5, it will still be the go-to Intimidate Pokemon. My guess is that Incineroar will end up being #2 to the most used Pokemon, knocking Landorus and Brian Hands out of contention, leaving it to do battle with Fluttermane, who I assume will end up being its #1 partner. Boys, I just want to quickly say a massive thank you to anyone who made it to the end of the video. I had a lot of fun making it, and I would love to start adding this kind of content to my channel more going forward. So please, if you could, let me know down below if you like this video, and while you're down there, consider hitting that like button as it really helps the channel grow. And if you're new around here, consider subscribing as we make some of the best VGC content out there. But before I head off, I want to leave you guys with one more thing. Fish Gang, rise up.